near the end of Saul's life. We've talked a little bit about what's going on about in the previous chapter about how he had gone in pursuit of David down in sort of the southeastern or southwestern region of Israel. David had been given yet another opportunity to kill Saul, as he had been able to slip into his camp, and could have put him to death, could have killed him right there on the ground, and did not. And David and Saul then have an exchange, hillside to hillside, out there in that area. And David, of course, has now gone, and he has decided to go into the land of the Philistines. He's going back to the area around Gath, which was to the west of Israel. The Philistines held most of that coastal region up the Mediterranean, and had a number of their cities there. And so Gath is to the west there. It's near the coast of the Mediterranean. And so he's decided to go there in frustration and in fear. He has decided to leave Israel behind and go with the Philistines. Saul, in the meantime, is confronted, as we started here in the 28th chapter. Saul is confronted again with the Philistine army moving against him, and he's desperate for help. He's just desperate for help. And we find here a man who, God, of course, has abandoned him. He knows God has abandoned him. And so he turns to another source. He decides to turn to this another source. He turns to this spirit medium, even though he had taken some effort. We saw this in this account that he had, in verse 3, Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. He had taken these people, he either made them leave or he'd put them to death, because this was an abomination. This was clearly an abomination. John pointed out even last week that when Saul had come back from attacking the Amalekites, but had left Agag and other animals of the Amalekites alive, he was supposed to have put them all to death. He did not. And Saul had come out and confronted him and said that this rebellion was as the sin of divination. And Saul apparently had a drive against divination. And yet here Samuel had put what he had done on a par with that. Well, now here is Samuel in his desperation. We see how low he is sunk. We have this ruined king who is going into the spirit medium, the spiritist, this, frankly, a fraudster, trying to get answers that he on the upcoming battle that he would have otherwise gotten from God, but God now is no longer communicating with him. We talked about the idea that he goes into her, he disguises. We see that he disguises himself in verse 8. He disguises himself and goes into her. Some of the commentators kind of go back and forth on this. There's a number of frankly conflicting viewpoints and counterposing arguments about this episode. One is that the spirit medium, this spiritist, this woman, recognized him immediately. Saul, of course, we know was a very tall man. It was described as a very tall man, and that this woman recognized him immediately. Well, that presupposes that, first of all, there are no other tall men in Israel, and that second of all, she would have gotten a good enough look at him to know that this was Saul. There is some suggestion, there is some other contrary evidence, even within the text, that she doesn't know that it's Saul until some of these events actually unfold. He goes into this woman. We talked about this last week. He swears we see how low he's sunk. We see how utterly ungodly he has become, because now here he is and he's swearing by the name of God to protect this woman who is violating the law of God. And so it gives us a measure of just how bad Saul has become. So he goes in, and we see here in verse 12. Then the woman, verse 11, the woman, who shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king said to her, do not be afraid, but do what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming out of the earth. Now, again, there's a number of things we need to understand here. The question comes as who brought up Saul? And there are two very conflicting opinions expressed by some of the commentators. The first of the opinions is that this woman has brought up a false spirit, a false presentation. She has brought up some sort of maybe some sort of a devil or something like that, with the intent of deceiving and discouraging Saul. There is some thought that this woman has brought up this evil spirit as a revenge against Saul. Of course, Saul has been persecuting the mediums and the spiritists, and since he has been persecuting them, she, in an act of revenge for her, who knows, friends, family, whatever, has initiated this exchange with the intent of humiliating him and of discouraging him and of deceiving him. That's one opinion from some of these commentators. The other opinion is a little more is that no, in fact, this woman sees this spirit coming up from the ground. There is nobody in the room more startled than she is, and that God has allowed the spirit of Samuel to reappear before Saul and deliver to him this final message of his basically of his disobedience. Frankly, I believe the second opinion is the correct one. I believe that what we know of the way these spiritists and mediums worked, especially at this time, was that they did not call spirits up out of the ground. The idea was that they would, most of you perhaps have seen, or several of you perhaps have seen the scene in the movie Ghost, if you remember that, and where the actress there, Whoopi Goldberg, and she pretends to be taken over by the spirit of some dear departed one and begins to speak as that dear departed one speaks. And that's the way they did this. That's the way these mediums would do this. That's the way a lot of mediums do it. They put on an act, if you will, of having that spirit sort of take possession of their body for a period of time, and speaking with the voice, or a distorted voice that's supposed to be the voice of the departed one. We don't find accounts where they were able to conjure up a separate spirit there, and so therefore there is that. First of all, there's that evidence that this isn't the way they normally did this. If they were trying to fake something, this isn't the way they did it. The second thing is that here is this spirit of Samuel, who, first of all, is once again, chastises Saul for being reprobate, and also can tell him exactly what's going to happen in the future, which the spirits, these evil spirits that we read about, do not have that ability. They do not have that capability. And so given these two facts, or this set of facts, I believe that we have to agree with the commentators who say, yes, this really was the spirit of spirit of Samuel coming up to confront Saul, sent by or allowed by God to confront him. Again, this woman sees this divine being coming up out of the ground. We see that Saul bows down. Saul apparently recognizes him and bows down to him, which of course was another act of hypocrisy on the part of Saul, because Saul didn't listen to him when he was alive. And now that he's dead, okay, now I'm ready to talk to you now that you're dead. That kind of an idea. Saul had ignored him. All through his life, Saul had ignored him. And now suddenly, now when I need you here, come and help me. Again, you see something of the self-centered nature of Saul. We've talked about that a little bit, but yeah, here's Saul being very self-centered, very focused on himself, and trying to win favor, I think, with Samuel when it's kind of too late. So here's Samuel. Samuel says, as he says here in verse 15, then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and answers me no more, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you make known to me what I should do. Notice his attitude. I need somebody to tell me what to do. Here's Saul, who's the king. He's been king for, nearly 40 years at this point, or approximately 40 years at this point. I need someone to tell me what to do. It's almost a childlike thing here. It's almost a pathetic thing here that Saul doesn't understand what to do. Saul and Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? Saul knew that. Saul knew that what he had done was displeasing to the Lord. He had been told that repeatedly by Saul. He'd even admitted it repeatedly in confrontation with David. He'd admitted it, and yet he wouldn't let go. He would not let go to his own will. He would not let go of his own ego. Yes. Yeah, he could have quit. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. Perhaps he could have avoided being killed in his battle. Yeah, what if on that confrontation, there's a lot of what ifs, there's a lot of, what if he had sincerely and what if he had sincerely and humbly had apologized to David and begged David's forgiveness so that David would have been reconciled with him. Would that extra 600 men that David had with him made a difference in this battle? We have to think it might have. As John says, what if he had simply told David at that point, yes, you're more worthy to be king than I am. Here, the kingdom is yours, and I'm going back home. I'm just going home. I'm clearly not up to this job. What if he had let go of his ego for a little bit and made a decision like that? And that now David is king, and how the outcome might have been differently. But here we see Samuel. Samuel absolutely will not let go. He will not let go of his ego. He will not let go of his control. And he's simply hurtling toward ruin, and he won't listen. Because as we hear what Samuel says, why do you ask me? The Lord has become your adversary. And the Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. So yeah, the kingdom is torn from you. You don't have a kingdom anymore. And as you did not obey the Lord, and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord shall give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of the Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Here he asked for advice from Samuel. He's got Samuel, the spirit of Samuel, there in front of him talking to him. And what does the spirit of Samuel says? He says, the Lord's going to give you over to the Philistines. The Lord is going to, you're going to get wiped out. It's sort of like, as if, you could go back in time and you could talk to General Custer going, don't go there. Don't go to that little bighorn. You're going to get wiped out. And, the prudent fellow might, if the prudent fellow is confronted by a spirit who says, if you go there, you're going to get wiped out, or when you go there, you're going to get wiped out, wouldn't you think that somebody might have said, maybe it's a good time to withdraw? Maybe it's a good time to pull back and maybe, find a little better fighting spot, or pull back into my fortified cities or something like that. I mean, here you're asking Samuel for advice. You're confronted by the spirit of Samuel. You recognize him as the spirit of Samuel. And that spirit says, you're going to get wiped out tomorrow. Wouldn't you have thought, maybe this battle isn't the best, maybe this isn't the best decision I've ever made to go into battle against the Philistines tomorrow. But once again, we find that Saul in his ego won't let it go. Why no? I've got to go fight the Philistines. I've already decided to go fight the Philistines, and that's what we're going to do. Good decision, bad decision, he won't let it go. Whatever decision he made, that's the direction it's all going to go. And we find folks like this even today. They make bad decisions, and they can't give up on those bad decisions. They won't give up on those bad decisions. And we find folks today that won't be Christians because they won't let go of a bad decision they made years before. Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Robe and tore it, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, Saul's not going to let it go. It's going to have to be ripped out of his hand. And that's a good point. That's an excellent point, Rita. Yeah, so yeah, back even at that time, that God through Samuel had said, yeah, that God is going to tear this out of your hand. And that's an interesting viewpoint, that he knew he'd have to tear it out of his hand, that that Saul rather would never give it up voluntarily. And yeah, sometimes there are things we've got to give up. We've got to give them up voluntarily. If we're going to serve God, we've got to give things up. And just like Samuel, though, there's people that are just like Saul, rather, there's people that just can't let it go. There are things that they just won't let go. One of the commentators made this point. I added this at the bottom of the slide because one of the commentators made this point. Oh, that was a good point. That we've got people today that, if they can't if they can't pray to God and get an answer that they like from God, then they'll seek out any other intercessor they think they can, come across, and come in search of another intercessor. If God isn't giving them the answer they want, they'll seek out somebody else. Maybe they'll seek out Mary, or maybe they'll seek out one of the apostles, or some other godly man to try and intercede for them. to give them an answer that they want to get that God isn't giving them. And just as the Bible says, though, in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5, that there is only one intercessor between man and God, and that is the man Jesus Christ. And so here we see, again, we see the example of Saul, who doesn't get the answer he wants, can't get it. God, you see what he says here. God has departed from me and answers me no more, either through prophets or by dreams. Well, there's almost a note of disappointment here from Saul, or almost, maybe a tone of whining, perhaps. Well, God won't answer me anymore through spirit or through dreams or through prophets or let's think about that now. Here's Saul, who has defied God at every turn, has disobeyed him when he was, after he was supposed to be in charge of Israel. God, he's disappointed God. He's disobeyed God repeatedly. He put all the priests, including the high priests and their families, to death at Nob. And he's basically conducted himself like a raging lunatic. And now he's got the gall to say, and now God won't talk to me. Well, guess what? It's just it's an amazing display of arrogance, amazing display of ego. So then verse 20. Then Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul and saw that he was terrified and said to him, Behold, your maidservant has obeyed you, and I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to your words which you spoke to me. So now please listen to the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a piece of bread before you that you may eat and have strength when you go on your way. But he refused and said, I will not eat. However, his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to them, and he arose from the ground and sat on the bed. And the woman had a fatted calf in the house, and she quickly slaughtered it, and she took flour, kneaded it, and unleavened bread from it. And she brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they arose and went away that night. And so here again, this woman terrified by what she's seen. This is not, like I said, in my mind, from what I understand of reading some of the historical texts and so forth, this is not the way the spiritists worked. They didn't, call up spirits out of the ground. They did the old, oh yeah, I've got, cousin Joe now occupying my body, and he'll tell you things about the great beyond and so forth. Notice her attitude is, hey, I've listened to you, so you need to listen to me, or you need to do something for me, which frankly is typically not Saul's characteristic. And yet here we see this sinful woman who becomes a source of comfort to Saul by providing food for him. Again, we see that even though Saul's terrified, even though Saul apparently understands the words of Samuel that's been given to him, he apparently really doesn't believe them, because he's convinced, hey, we're gonna go fight the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. We're still gonna go into this battle, and you would have thought if he had really believed what Samuel said, why wouldn't it have made sense to maybe withdraw, to maybe pick a more defensible ground than fighting on a hillside? You would have thought he would have found a different way. He would have looked for a different way. But no, apparently he is determined to just charge right on straight ahead and get himself into trouble. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a good point. She's trying to, yeah, give it no, yeah, his erratic behavior, his your friend 1 minute and your enemy the next kind of behavior, uh, might have easily led her to be terrified. She perhaps is fully aware that he leans one way 1 minute and then leans the other way another. And you're right. You're quite right, Rick. That's a good point. That he might have gotten up from all this and decided, well, I don't need you anymore, and go ahead and put her to death. That's an excellent point. So she's kind of essentially begging for her life in preparing this food. All right, now we return from there. We go back to David. Here's now David. He's with Achish over in Gath, and we find the fix that he's in. Now the Philistines gather together. Now, if you remember what's happened now, David has gone to Achish. He's got himself into basically into the service of the Philistine king there, Achish. He's been given the city of Ziklag. Ziklag, of course, is down in the. It is a border. It is a border city between the Philistines and the nation of Israel. And David is using this down in it sort of it would have been the southeastern section of Philistia, the southwestern section of Israel. And he's using this as a base of operations, and he's conducting raids from there down against various tribes that are to the south, to the southwest, to the southeast. But he's been telling Achish, if you recall, he's been telling Achish, yeah, I've been raiding up into Israel. I've been going east and northeast and raiding Israel. And therefore, Achish is convinced that, yeah, David's making himself despised by the Israelites. Well, David, pulls off this deception for a period of time, but now David finds himself in a fix because it's, and we'll see here now in chapter 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years? And I have found no fault with him from the day he deserted to me to this day. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, make this man go back, and he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us, lest in the battle he should become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang in the dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? So here we find the fifth situation. David now is pulled into a he's got this alliance with Achish. Well, now he's pulled into a situation where Achish is going to go to war, and he's going to go to war with the rest of the Philistines, and they're going to go to war against Israel. So now David is finally finding himself in a position where he's being called to go to war against his own people. And the question is, how's he going to do that? Over and over again, he has spared Saul. Over and over again, he has refused to raise a hand against Saul. Now here's Achish basically demanding, hey, we're going to go fight Saul. You're coming along. And so he finds himself kind of, as we say, in a proverbial rock and a hard place here. He facing this situation. Achish, of course, has been fooled by David, but we see these arguments of these Philistine commanders as they are arguing. This has been a long conflict now between the Philistines and the Israelites. We recall back in the book of Judges, Samson was fighting the Philistines. There has been this long-running conflict between these two nations for centuries at this point, over a century at this point at least, over a century, they have been battling one another. And so you can imagine there's this long period of distrust with one another, this long period of conflict. And suddenly these commanders see the David and his Hebrew army in with Hebrew, at least Hebrew force in there with Achish, and going, what are these guys doing? They have perhaps remember the Battle of Gibeah, which we read about back in chapter 14, where the Hebrews that had allied themselves with the Philistines suddenly switched sides because Saul was winning, and they suddenly switched sides and joined with Saul and attacked the Philistines. And the commanders of these Philistines don't want that happening again, clearly. They argue, as you see here, they argue, oh, no, wait a minute. Here's David. He wants to they have no idea why David is out of favor with Saul, or perhaps only have a limited idea why David is out of favor with Saul, but figure that one of the surest ways for David to get back into Saul's good graces would be to come in with this victory over all these Philistines and bring him the heads of these commanders as a trophy, saying, look, Saul, look what I did for you. Why, isn't that a great way? Why wouldn't he take that avenue to get himself back in good with Saul? And finally, then they offer the argument, this is the guy, remember, this is the guy they've been singing about, where Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And who do you think those tens of thousands were, Achish? Well, they were Philistines. And so they're basically saying, no, they're voting him off the island. You don't get to stay. You don't get to come with us and fight. You're going to go on your way and go back where you came from. Basically, they're telling him, you go back where you came from. And we consider this, though, if we look at this, this is the providence of God. Because, again, David here is between a rock and a hard place. We've already pointed out that when Achish tells him, calls him up and says, you're going to go to fight, that David had given him a fairly ambiguous answer about how things were going to go. And David says, and so here is clearly, God has given him a way of escape. We note that out of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, that God will not allow us to be tempted more than we can endure, but gives us a way of escape. Well, here's what he does for David. David is about to be tempted, really past what he can handle, and God gives him then this way of escape. We might ask, what did David really intend to do in this coming battle? What did he really intend to do? We may never know. Would he have fought against his own people? Would he have fought against Saul and Jonathan? We got to have, the answer's got to be no. We really can't see David fighting against Saul and Jonathan. He's, again, had plenty of opportunity. He's had 2 opportunities to kill Saul and didn't take them. We know that he loves Jonathan like his own soul. He's not going to kill his best friend. So what's he going to do? And as the events turn out, we'll never know, because ultimately David doesn't have to do it. David, though, says, and we might wonder about the words of David here, but then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and coming in with me, and the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now, therefore, return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. So Achish dismisses them and explains why. Basically saying, well, it's nothing you've done, but these other lords, these other guys, they're unhappy. They're uncomfortable. They're not going to go along with this, and so you're going to have to leave. David said to Achish, what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came to you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Now, this suggests perhaps that either David is bluffing. This is a fairly massive bluff on David's part, or that David had some ulterior plan that he was going to try and pull off, and now he's going to be stopped from pulling off that plan. Again, we don't know. We don't know what that plan might have been, but clearly the evidence here is that David, at least on the surface, appears to be putting on some kind of a show for Achish of, hey, I really wanted to go fight, and now I don't get to. I really, really wanted to go. And again, we don't know whether to take that with if this is just David doing a little song and dance here to kind of keep himself in the good graces of Achish, or if David really had some kind of ulterior plan, and now that ulterior plan has been short-circuited. We don't know, but it is interesting that David's attitude is not, okay, well, thanks anyway, I'll see you later, but rather to protest this. It's my opinion, frankly, that this is all, frankly, smoke and mirrors on David's part. I really believe that David had no intention of going and fighting against Israel. He certainly had no intention of going and fighting against Saul and Jonathan. He may have had some kind of a plan to maybe try and rescue Saul and Jonathan and thought that this was his best avenue to do so. But I really believe that this little protest here that David gives here is more for Achish's benefit than for anything else. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's an interesting question, and the answer is that we don't know. But yes. Yeah, see, David's answer there is, David's statement there is very ambiguous because it could be taken a number of ways. Well, I'm going to go fight against the enemies of my Lord. Well, who do you mean, David? Do you mean Achish? Do you mean Saul? Do you mean Jehovah? Well, later on, of course, David could say, well, yeah, I really meant Saul, or I really meant Jehovah. But Achish, of course, just assumes he means, my enemies. But your point is exactly right. It's well taken in that when David says, I'm going to fight against the enemies of my Lord, there's a number of ways that could be interpreted. And perhaps David is hedging himself a little bit. David is being a little misdirect, a little bit of misdirection here. As he's using words, you can see he's picking his words very carefully, perhaps with the intent of not revealing what he intends to do. And that's an excellent point, Rita. We see David here. Here's a man. If we look at what David ultimately says, again, we have the advantage with David because we get to actually see into his mind a little bit from his own writings. And we look and see what David wrote, for example, in Psalm 15. In Psalm 15, he writes, O Lord, who may abide in thy tent? Who may dwell in thy holy city? On thy holy hill. Sorry, on thy holy hill. He who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He does not slander with the tongue. Nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. He does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. And so you read those words of David that he wrote there in Psalm 15, for example, and we try and reconcile that with this man that we find here in Psalm 29, in 1 Samuel 29, who's being duplicitous, who's being I'm not sure what other duplicitous. I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for. He's being misdirecting. He is deliberately misdirecting. He's probably deliberately lying And so you try and reconcile this, and it's clear that we have in David, then, when we see that, we have in David a man who's conflicted within himself. He is ashamed of his lying, he's ashamed of his other sins, but still manages to find a way to do what he needs to do, to protect himself. And undoubtedly, he's perhaps justifying his actions in his own mind as, keeping himself alive. But we find that he has that, apparently has that conflict in himself of not being able to kind of completely come to grips with his own behavior. We read over in James. It's kind of called to my mind this passage in James, and undoubtedly one that's familiar to most of us. James, the 3rd chapter, and verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into horses' mouths so that they may obey us, we direct the entire body as well. Behold, the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. Behold, how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members, that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of birds and beasts, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and God, our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have made a name in the likeness of God. For with the same mouth come forth blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be. Does a fountain send forth the same opening, both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Neither can salt water produce fresh. And we see here David, again, struggling with these very same things. With that same mouth, he's praising God, and he's calling for men to be righteous. And yet with that same mouth, he's lying through his teeth to Achash. Yes. Oh, certainly they did. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, maybe you need to go home because we don't want you. If I'm going to have anybody standing behind me with a sword, I think it's going to be somebody I really, really trust. And I don't really, really trust you. So, good point. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll continue on with chapter 30, probably wrap up this book then at the end of next week. I appreciate your attention and comments this morning.
You want to go get the water?
still working?
I got it. Yeah.
No.
Good morning. We're light this morning. It seems like there's a lot. I have several travelers, but and several are out, but I don't think I got them all by any means. Anyway, you're here. We're glad to have you. We do have some visitors. Very glad to have them always. And always invite any questions that you might have about anything we say or do here. We would certainly like to talk to you about it. First song will be number 110. Nathaniel will be leading that. It will be on the board above here, so you don't necessarily need the books. The only sick I know of is Gilda Young, and Mark says she's not doing too good right now. They still got her on the breathing under the tent, and so she's not doing very well. Brother Prong has some visitors with him. He told me their names, and I'm sorry to say